After being rescued by a fisherman, the millionaire was struck motionless when he saw the pendant, identical to the one he had given to his beloved before she vanished 18 years ago. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, Michael Delaney was standing on the deck of his luxurious yacht, gazing out over the tranquil, endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The next, everything changed. The sky darkened rapidly, clouds swelling with an unsettling force. He barely had time to react before the wind roared to life, howling through the air, and the waves grew into towering giants, crashing mercilessly against the sides of the yacht. Michael gripped the railing tightly, feeling the violent tremors as the boat was tossed about like a mere toy in the hands of the sea. Panic crept up on him. His knuckles whitened as he clenched the railing even harder, fighting to maintain his balance. He had been out here, cruising along the California coastline, hoping for some peace and clarity. But now, peace was a distant thought. The storm grew fiercer, rain pouring down in sheets so thick, he could barely make out anything beyond a few feet. The yacht groaned, tilting dangerously to one side as waves slammed into it from every direction. His heart raced as he knew he had to act fast. Michael rushed to the helm, desperate to steer the boat back to shore, but it was hopeless. The storm was too fierce, the sea too wild. Suddenly, a deafening crack filled the air, and Michael's world flipped sideways. The yacht had struck something. Perhaps rocks, but whatever it was, the impact sent him flying across the deck, his body slamming against the railings. A sharp pain shot through his side, but there was no time to focus on it. The yacht was sinking. His survival instincts kicked in, and he scrambled to his feet, gripping the railing to stay upright as the boat lurched uncontrollably. He stumbled toward the emergency life raft, but before he could reach it, a monstrous wave crashed over the deck, knocking him off his feet. The freezing water swept him under, pulling him deeper into the ocean. For a moment everything went black. Michael had no idea which way was up or down as the waves tossed him like a rag doll. His lungs screamed for air, but all he could feel was the crushing weight of the water, dragging him deeper into the depths. Then, as quickly as it had started, the chaos began to subside. Michael felt himself drifting weightless, his fight slowly fading. Somewhere deep inside, a thought about Emily surfaced, the woman who had disappeared from his life 18 years ago. He had never stopped searching for her, never stopped loving her, even when the world told him to move on. Now it seemed like he might soon join her, lost to the sea forever. But fate had other plans. Michael woke with a sharp gasp, his body jerking awake as though jolted by an electric shock. He blinked rapidly, disoriented, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. The sound of crashing waves had vanished, replaced by the faint rustling of wind through trees and the rhythmic drip of water. He was no longer in the ocean. Slowly, he lifted his head and scanned his surroundings. He was lying on a rough wooden floor, covered by a blanket that smelled faintly of salt and smoke. The room was small, dimly lit by the soft glow of a lantern hanging overhead. His body ached, every muscle stiff and sore, but he was alive. "Easy now," a deep voice rumbled from nearby. Michael turned his head, wincing at the sharp pain in his side, to see a man sitting in a chair by the door. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with weathered skin and a scruffy beard. He wore simple clothes, worn jeans and a flannel shirt, the type a fisherman would wear. Where am I?" Michael rasped, his voice barely audible. "You're safe," the man replied, standing up and walking over to him. "I found you washed up on the beach after the storm. You're lucky to be alive." Michael tried to sit up, but the pain in his ribs made him wince. "My boat? It's gone," he muttered. The man shook his head. "The storm tore it to pieces." Michael let out a slow breath as the gravity of the situation sank in. His yacht, his pride and joy was gone. But he was alive. And for now that was all that mattered. "What's your name?" the man asked, crouching beside him. "Michael," he replied, still catching his breath. "I'm Jack. Jack Coleman," the man said, extending a hand. Michael took it, shaking it weakly. Jack's grip was firm, his eyes kind but sharp, like a man who had weathered many storms. "Thank you," Michael murmured. "I owe you my life." Jack shrugged nonchalantly, just doing what anyone would have done. But as Michael lay back, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random act of kindness. There was something about this place, about Jack, that felt strangely familiar, even though Michael knew they had never met before. He was alive, but his journey was only beginning. Days passed, and Michael slowly regained his strength. Jack was kind but kept mostly to himself. He checked on Michael regularly, offering food and water, but their conversations remained brief. Michael spent most of his time resting, his thoughts wandering. His mind often drifted back to New York, to his life of luxury, and inevitably to Emily. Even after all these years, her disappearance lingered in his mind. Every decision, every move he made in his career was overshadowed by the memory of the woman he had lost. But here in this small house by the sea, something stirred inside him. There was something about Jack, about this place, that pulled at old wounds, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't mere coincidence. One morning, after finally managing to get to his feet and move around the house, Michael's gaze fell upon something that made his heart skip a beat. Jack was standing at the kitchen sink, his back to Michael, and around his neck, swinging gently as he worked, was a pendant. A small, delicate heart-shaped pendant. It was the same pendant, the very one Michael had given to Emily all those years ago. A gift before she had disappeared. He had spent countless nights wishing he had done something differently, anything to change the outcome. His heart began to race, pounding in his chest, as the realization hit him like a freight train. Michael felt dizzy, the room spinning around him as he struggled to maintain his composure. How could this be happening? How could Jack, a fisherman living in such isolation, have the pendant he had given to Emily all those years ago? His fists clenched as he fought against the overwhelming wave of emotions threatening to overtake him. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe Jack had found it somewhere, perhaps at a flea market or an antique shop. But deep down, Michael knew the truth. This wasn't just a random occurrence. Without thinking, Michael's voice broke through the silence, his words strained with tension. That pendant. Jack froze, his hands still submerged in the running water. The sound of the faucet was the only noise that filled the quiet kitchen. Slowly, Jack turned to face him, his brow furrowed as he locked eyes with Michael. What about it? Michael's throat went dry, but he forced himself to speak. Where did you get it? Jack's gaze dropped to the pendant, and his fingers instinctively reached up to touch it. For a long moment he said nothing, simply staring at the small silver heart in his hand. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he let out a heavy sigh. I found it. Found it. Michael pressed, his voice rising slightly in frustration. Jack met his gaze, his expression calm but guarded. Years ago, Jack continued, his tone steady but distant, I found it on a woman I pulled from the water. The world around Michael seemed to blur as Jack's words echoed in his mind. A woman pulled from the water. His heart began to race as he took a step forward. When? How long ago? Jack scratched the back of his neck, clearly uneasy with the sudden intensity of the questions. 18 years ago, give or take. There was a storm, kinda like the one we had last week. I found her washed up on the shore, unconscious. She couldn't remember who she was or where she came from. Michael's hands trembled as the weight of Jack's words sank in. 18 years ago, the same amount of time that Emily had been missing. His mind spun, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place, but the more he thought about it, the more his stomach churned. And this woman, Michael whispered, his voice barely audible, is she still here? Jack's gaze softened slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. She's my wife now. Mary, Michael repeated, the name unfamiliar and strange on his tongue. His chest tightened, a sharp pain in his heart as he fought to breathe. Mary, Jack confirmed, his eyes studying Michael carefully. Could he meet her? The question burned in Michael's chest, and he barely managed to force the words out. Could I meet her? Jack hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing Michael's intent. Why are you asking all these questions, Michael? Michael swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. He couldn't tell Jack everything, not yet. Not until he was sure. It's just the pendant. It belonged to someone I cared about. I need to know if it's a coincidence, or if... Jack's face softened ever so slightly, but the wariness never left his eyes. She'll be back soon. You can meet her then. Michael nodded, though the tension in the room was thick and suffocating. He could hardly keep himself from exploding. If Mary was really Emily, if she had been alive all this time living with no memory of her past, how could he confront her? And what about Jack? The man who had saved her, cared for her all these years. How could Michael rip apart their lives just to reclaim what he had lost? He didn't have the answers to any of those questions. All he knew was that he had to see her. He had to know the truth. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael stood by the window, watching the waves crash against the shore. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: hope, fear, anger, confusion, each tangled together in a storm of its own. He had no idea what he would say when he saw her. He didn't know how she would react. But one thing was certain. His life and hers was about to change forever. The evening light faded into the dusky shadows of night, casting long silhouettes across the weathered house. Michael paced back and forth by the window, his thoughts running in circles around the same impossible question. Could it really be Emily? Could this Mary Jack spoke of be the woman he had loved and lost all those years ago? Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. His heart hammered in his chest, and he could feel the tension in every part of his body as he prepared himself for whatever might happen. Then the sound of footsteps outside caused him to freeze. His body stiffened as the door creaked open. Jack stepped in first, wiping his hands on a towel, his face unreadable. And behind him, Michael caught a glimpse of a woman entering the house. For a moment time seemed to stop, and the air felt thick, as if the room was closing in on him. She was here. The woman who stepped through the door was older than the image that had been burned into Michael's memory. But despite the years, there was no mistaking her. It was Emily. Her features had softened with age, her hair falling gently over her shoulders, and that familiar curve to her smile. It was her. She had aged, but she was still beautiful, still the woman he had loved with all his heart. But she wasn't Emily anymore. "Mary," Jack said, placing the towel on the table. "This is Michael, the guy I told you about. The one I found after the storm." Michael's throat tightened as Mary turned her gaze toward him. She smiled politely, the warmth of a stranger offering a greeting to a guest. But there was no flicker of recognition, no spark of familiarity. She didn't know him. She didn't remember him. "Nice to meet you," she said softly, her voice kind as she extended her hand. Michael hesitated for a moment, his heart hammering in his chest, before he reached out and took her hand. The feel of her skin, the touch of her fingers, it was so familiar yet distant. A lump formed in his throat, and he struggled to find the right words. "You too," he managed to choke out, his voice betraying the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. She smiled again, a small, pleasant smile, before turning toward the kitchen to help Jack prepare dinner. Michael stood frozen, his eyes fixed on Mary as she moved about the room with a quiet, graceful confidence, as if everything around her was perfectly normal. The scene felt otherworldly. For 18 long years, Michael had imagined what it would be like to see Emily again. But this was something entirely different. The woman standing before him wasn't Emily anymore. She was Mary, Jack's wife, living a peaceful life by the sea, completely unaware of the past she had left behind. The dinner table was heavy with unspoken tension. Jack and Mary chatted easily, exchanging light conversation about the day's work and the storm that was predicted to arrive soon. Meanwhile, Michael sat there struggling to focus. His mind was a whirlwind, unable to settle on anything, as the reality of what he was witnessing started to sink in. "So, Michael," Mary began, her voice breaking through the haze of his thoughts. "Jack tells me you're from New York." Michael nodded mechanically, his throat dry as he forced himself to speak. "Yeah, I've been living there for a while now. Work keeps me busy." Mary smiled kindly, though her eyes held a distant quality. "I've never been to New York. I imagine it's much different than here." "You could say that," Michael replied, his voice strained, the words feeling like a struggle. He wanted to ask her, to probe deeper, to find out if there was even a spark of recognition buried somewhere inside her. Did she remember anything? Did she feel any trace of who she used to be? But he couldn't. Not yet. Not now. Jack cleared his throat, sensing the tension hanging in the air. "Michael's been through a lot recently," he explained, his voice softer. "Lost his boat in the storm. I thought he could stay with us for a while until he gets back on his feet." Mary nodded, her face lighting up with warmth. Of course. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. Michael barely heard her words. His mind was far from the table, still racing with the impossible situation in front of him. How could she not remember? How could she look at him with those same eyes? Eyes that once held so much love, and not recognize him? Later, as the evening deepened and the shadows grew long, Jack excused himself to go outside and secure the boat for the incoming storm. Michael found himself alone with Mary, and the air between them seemed to thicken with every passing moment. "So, Mary," she said softly, leaning against the kitchen counter, her voice gentle, "Jack told me you were asking about the pendant." Michael's heart lurched, a jolt of surprise running through him. He hadn't expected her to bring it up so soon, but now that she had, he couldn't hold back. "Yeah, it looks like one I gave to someone a long time ago." Mary raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Really? That's odd. Jack found it with me." Michael's pulse quickened. "When?" "When he rescued me," she replied, her voice low. A rush of emotions flooded Michael's chest, and for a moment he was speechless. He wanted to demand answers. He wanted to shout that she was the one he had lost. But he held back. He couldn't risk destroying the life she had now. "Do you remember anything about before Jack found you?" Mary's expression softened, a flicker of sadness passing through her eyes. "Not much. There are just flashes, snippets. Little moments. It's like trying to remember a dream after you wake up. Like the feeling is just out of reach." Michael's chest tightened. She was so close yet so far. He could feel the gravity of her words, the deep sense of loss that came with them. He wanted so badly to pull her back, to make her remember, but how could he? How could he bring her back into a life she no longer even knew? "You seem familiar," Mary said suddenly, her voice tentative, as if she wasn't sure whether she should say it. "Like I've seen you before." Michael's breath caught in his throat. A flicker of hope ignited inside him. "Maybe we've crossed paths before," he suggested cautiously. "You never know." She smiled faintly, but there was something in her eyes. An elusive spark, a flicker of something deeper. "Maybe," she said softly. Before Michael could say anything else, the door creaked open and Jack returned, cutting the moment short. Mary stood straighter, casting one last lingering look at Michael before turning to help Jack. Michael stood there, caught between the past and the present, his heart torn. He had found her. He had found Emily. But she wasn't Emily anymore. And now he wasn't sure if he could ever bring her back. Days passed in a blur. The reality of what had happened still hung heavy in Michael's mind, and he stayed in the modest house by the sea, watching Mary from a distance. She seemed happy here, so content in this life with Jack. She smiled easily, laughed often, and moved with a quiet assurance that Michael hadn't seen in her before. She had built a life for herself, far away from the chaos and luxury of New York. It should have been comforting to see her so at peace, but instead it only deepened the ache in Michael's chest. He couldn't stop himself from wondering if he had any right to interfere. Mary, had no memory of the life they once shared. She had no recollection of the years they spent together, the love they had built. Was it fair to pull her back into a life she had forgotten? He wasn't sure. But every time he looked at her, the past rushed back, and the need to tell her the truth only grew stronger. Then one night everything changed. It began with a dream. Michael was jolted awake in the middle of the night by muffled cries coming from the other room. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear the sound. It was faint but unmistakable. It was Mary. Without thinking, he threw off the blankets and rushed down the hallway. He reached her door, slightly ajar, and saw her tossing restlessly in her sleep, her face contorted in distress. Jack slept soundly beside her, completely unaware of the turmoil unfolding in the next bed. Michael paused at the door, unsure whether to wake her, but then he heard her voice. The soft, broken words stopped him cold. "No. No. Don't go. Don't leave me." Her voice was filled with pain, with fear. It was the same tone she had used all those years ago, when she had begged him not to leave for yet another trip. The words cut through him like a knife. Michael stepped closer, his heart racing, as he realized what was happening. She was dreaming about him. "Please come back. Don't leave." Her words became more desperate, her hands clenching at the sheets as if reaching for someone or something that wasn't there. The weight of the years they had lost crushed down on him, and for a fleeting moment, he longed to reach out, to wake her, to remind her that he had never left. But he couldn't. Not yet. Suddenly, Mary gasped, her eyes snapping open as she sat up in bed, breathing heavily. Michael took a step back into the shadows, his heart hammering in his chest as she ran a hand through her disheveled hair. She looked at Jack, still asleep beside her, then let out a shaky breath before quietly slipping out of bed. Michael quietly retreated down the hall, slipping into the living room just as Mary padded softly out of the bedroom. Her bare feet barely made a sound on the wooden floor. She didn't notice him as she made her way to the window, wrapping her arms around herself as she gazed. She stood there for what seemed like an eternity, her gaze lost in the distance. Michael stood frozen, his heart heavy, watching her silently. She looked so far away, as though searching for something that remained just beyond her reach. In that moment, Michael realized something was shifting in her. A change he had been waiting for. The way her brows furrowed, the tightness in her arms as if she were clinging to herself, struggling to keep it all together. It was clear. Her memories were coming back to her. But they were fragmented, like a puzzle that couldn't be solved. And those fragmented memories were already enough to unsettle her, to make her doubt everything she thought she knew about herself. Michael took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he stepped toward her. "Mary!" She jumped at the sound of his voice, spinning around in surprise. "Michael, I didn't know you were still awake." "I heard you," he said gently, keeping his tone calm. "You were talking in your sleep." Her expression faltered, and her hands dropped to her sides. "I was." Michael nodded. "You were calling out for someone. You seemed upset." Mary's gaze drifted back to the window, avoiding his eyes. "It was just a dream," she muttered, though there was a hesitation in her voice, a subtle uncertainty, as if she wasn't convinced by her own words. "Do you remember what it was about?" Michael asked quietly, stepping a little closer. For a long moment she didn't respond. She shook her head slowly, her shoulders slumping slightly in a gesture of defeat. "No, not really. I don't remember much of anything. It's like, there's something I should know, something just out of reach. It's frustrating." Michael's chest tightened at the sadness in her voice, the confusion that had settled deep inside her. He wanted to be the one to help her, to fill in the gaps, to tell her everything. But he knew it wasn't that simple. A life she had built for herself. He couldn't just shatter that without knowing how she truly felt. "I've been having these dreams for a while now," Mary continued softly, her voice distant. "Flashes of places, faces, things that don't make sense. But when I wake up, it's like they slip away, just out of my grasp." Michael felt a wave of urgency wash over him. She was so close to remembering. "Maybe those are your memories," he said, his voice tentative but filled with hope. "Sometimes when people lose their memory, pieces come back in fragments like dreams. Maybe that's what's happening to you." Mary frowned, her brow furrowing as she thought about his words. "Memories," she murmured. She seemed to be considering the idea but still unsure. "But why would I have forgotten everything? What happened to me?" Michael's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. The moment he could finally tell her the truth. But before the words could leave his mouth, the sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted, making both of them turn. Jack appeared in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His brow furrowed with concern as he looked between the two of them. "Everything okay out here?" Michael forced a smile, his heart sinking as the opportunity slipped away. "Yeah, everything's fine." As Jack walked toward them, Mary retreated back into the comforting routine of her life. Michael watched her go, knowing that everything had just shifted again, that the truth he was holding onto was still locked away. The days that followed were filled with a delicate balance. Michael stayed in the small house by the sea, but the air was thick with unspoken words. Mary, more often lost in thought, seemed to struggle with a quiet internal conflict. She was searching for something, a memory, a truth, that she couldn't quite reach. Michael observed her closely, though always from a distance. He was torn. On one hand, he wanted to tell her everything, to make her remember who she was. On the other, he feared what revealing the truth would do to her, to them all. Jack had been nothing but kind to him, offering him shelter and food, showing him compassion. But Jack had kept this truth from Mary for years. That reality gnawed at Michael, making him question everything. One afternoon, as Michael walked along the jagged coastline, trying to clear his mind, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Mary approaching, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, her face contemplative. She offered him a small smile before stopping beside him, her eyes drifting toward the horizon. "This place is beautiful, isn't it?" she said quietly, the wind carrying her words. Michael nodded, though his thoughts were far from the scenery. "Yeah, it is." They stood there together in silence, listening to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. Michael could feel the weight of the unspoken questions hanging in the air, questions Mary had yet to voice. He knew she was searching for something deep inside herself. He just wondered if she would ever find it on her own. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Mary said suddenly, her gaze still fixed on the ocean. "About the past." Michael's chest tightened. He had prepared for this moment, yet now that it was happening he felt unprepared. "About what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jack told me that I washed up here with no memory of who I was," she continued, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's strange, not knowing where you came from." Michael swallowed hard. He had spent every moment of the last few days dreading this conversation, but now that it was unfolding, he didn't know how to respond. "I can't imagine how hard that must be," he said quietly. "To not know who you are, where you belong." Mary nodded, her brow furrowed with deep thought. "I've never questioned it before. Jack has been so good to me. He saved me, gave me a new life. I've been happy here. But lately I keep wondering, what if there's more to my story? What if I had a life before all this?" Michael's pulse quickened, every part of him screaming to finally tell her everything. But something held him back. Was it his place to shatter the fragile peace she had built? "Do you really want to know?" he asked cautiously, his voice low. Mary turned her gaze to him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something deeper. "I think I do," she said softly. "It's been years. And for the longest time I thought it didn't matter. But now these dreams, these flashes of memories, they're haunting me. I can't stop thinking about them. It's like my mind is trying to tell me something, but I can't make sense of it." Michael felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The truth he wasn't ready to tell, but the truth that now seemed so close to being revealed. Michael opened his mouth ready to speak, but before he could get the words out, a voice called from behind them. "Mary!" They both turned to see Jack walking toward them, his expression filled with concern. Michael's heart sank as he realized the moment had slipped away again. "I've been looking for you," Jack said as he reached them, his eyes flicking between Mary and Michael. "We need to talk." Mary frowned, glancing back at Michael before turning to face Jack. "What is it?" Jack hesitated, his jaw tightening, and Michael could see the tension in his posture. "It's about Michael," he said finally, his tone cautious. Michael's pulse quickened. He'd known this conversation was coming, but he hadn't expected it to unfold like this. He braced himself, unsure of what Jack would say. Mary looked confused, glancing between the two men. "What do you mean?" Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. How Michael showed up here, all the questions he's been asking. I think there's more to his story than he's letting on." A wave of panic surged in Michael's chest. He had done everything to keep the truth hidden, hoping he'd find the right time to tell Mary who she really was. But now Jack was about to force his hand. Mary turned to Michael, her eyes filled with confusion. "Michael, is that true?" Michael hesitated, his throat tightening as the words got stuck. He could feel Jack's eyes on him, sharp with suspicion and protectiveness. It was clear that Jack was starting to question Michael's intentions. He had been worried about this moment, but now it was unavoidable. Michael began, his voice faltering. "There's something you need to know, Mary. Something about your past." Jack stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Michael, don't." Michael spun to face him, his heart racing. "She deserves to know the truth, Jack." Mary looked between the two of them, her confusion deepening. "What truth? What are you talking about?" Jack's jaw clenched, his body tense, But then he took a step back, his shoulders slumping slightly as if in resignation. Fine, he said quietly, his voice drained. If you want to tell her, go ahead. Michael swallowed hard, turning back to Mary. Her wide eyes were filled with fear and anticipation, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. His hands were shaking slightly, but he knew he had to do this. Your name isn't Mary, he said softly, his voice steady but firm. Your real name is Emily. Emily Turner. You disappeared 18 years ago, and I've been looking for you ever since. For a long moment there was silence. Emily stared at him, her face blank as if she couldn't quite process what he had just told her. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, the tension in the air so thick it was suffocating. Then slowly Emily shook her head. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. That's not possible. I don't remember any of that. Michael took a step closer, his voice gentle yet unwavering. I know it's a lot to take in, but it's the truth. You had a life before this one. A life with me. We were in love, Emily. We were going to get married. Emily's eyes welled with tears, her hands trembling as she took a step back. I don't understand. Michael's chest tightened with pain, but he pressed on, determined to help her remember. You don't have to understand it all right now. Just trust me. But as he reached out to her, Emily shook her head again, tears spilling down her cheeks. I can't do this. And with that she turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing there, heartbroken and unsure of what to do next. Michael stood frozen, watching as Emily, no Mary, disappeared back toward the house. His heart ached in a way he hadn't felt in years. It was the kind of pain that came from seeing something you desperately wanted slip through your fingers, knowing there was nothing you could do to stop it. Jack was silent beside him. The weight of the moment hung heavy between them. Michael could feel the tension radiating off Jack, as though he had been holding something back all this time. It wasn't just suspicion or protectiveness, Michael said, his voice tight with frustration. There's something more, isn't there? Jack took a deep breath, his voice low and resigned. Come around. Michael turned to face him, anger rising inside him. You knew, didn't you? You knew who she really was. Jack's face darkened, his jaw tightening. For a moment Michael thought he might deny it, but instead Jack let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping as though a great weight had settled upon him. I knew, Jack said quietly. I've always known. Michael's fists clenched at his sides. Then why? Why didn't you tell her? Why would you let her live like this with no memory of her past? No idea who she really is? Jack met Michael's gaze, his expression unreadable. Because I was afraid, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Afraid that if she remembered she'd leave and I'd lose everything. Michael's chest tightened with anger. You kept her here, trapped in a life that wasn't hers, just because you were afraid. That's not love, Jack. That's selfishness. Jack flinched, but he didn't back down. Maybe it is, he said, his voice quiet. But you weren't here, Michael. You didn't see her when I found her, broken, scared, with no memory of anything. She was lost. And I gave her a life. A new start. I gave her peace. Michael shook his head, the frustration boiling over. You gave her a lie. Jack's face hardened again, his eyes flashing with anger. And what would you have done? He snapped. Would you have taken her back to New York, thrown her back into the chaos of the life she ran away from? Because that's what she was doing, Michael. She was running. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, the pieces of the puzzle starting to click into place. Emily had been running. But from what? From him. From their life together. It didn't make sense. I never meant to keep her from you, Jack continued, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. But when she didn't remember, I thought maybe it was for the best. She found a new life here. A life that made her happy. Who was I to take that away from her? Michael felt the weight of Jack's words pressing down on him, but his anger still simmered beneath the surface. You took away her choice, he said, his voice tight. You didn't let her decide for herself. Jack nodded slowly, his face filled with regret. I know, he said quietly. I know, Jack said, his voice heavy with regret. And maybe that's the biggest mistake I've made. But now you've told her, and there's no going back. Michael turned away, running a hand through his hair as he tried to make sense of it all. Jack's confession had shaken him, but it didn't change the fact that Mary was still in the dark. She deserved to know everything, not just fragments of the truth. And what about Sophie? Michael asked abruptly, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Does she know? At the mention of Sophie's name, Jack's body stiffened. His eyes narrowed with sudden tension.
No.
She doesn't know. She thinks Mary is her mother, and I'm her father. That's been the story since she was born. Michael's heart clenched. Sophie, his daughter, had grown up with Jack as her father. She had no idea that the man standing beside her wasn't the one who had given her life. He felt the weight of it, and a surge of urgency pushed him forward. You can't keep this from her, Jack, Michael said, his tone firm. She deserves to know the truth. She deserves to know who her real father is. Jack's face darkened, and for a brief moment, Michael thought he might fight him on this. But Jack just exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. I know, Jack said, his voice quieter now, filled with a weariness that Michael couldn't ignore. But it's not simple. Sophie. She's everything to me. If she finds out, if the truth comes out, everything we've built could fall apart. Michael's chest tightened, a mixture of sympathy and frustration flooding through him. He understood the fear. Jack was afraid of losing everything. He understood that fear. But that didn't change the fact that Sophie needed the truth. And so did Emily. You can't keep lying to her, Michael said softly but with urgency. She needs to know who she is. Jack hesitated, his voice low with self-doubt. I don't know what's right anymore. I wanted to protect them. I thought if I kept this hidden I could keep their lives together. But now I'm starting to question everything. Michael looked at Jack, his anger melting into something more complicated. Something like empathy. Jack wasn't a bad man. He'd made mistakes, but it wasn't out of malice. It was out of fear. Fear of losing the family he had fought so hard to keep. We can still fix this, Michael said, his voice calmer now. But we have to be honest with them. We have to tell them everything. They deserve that. Jack nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging in resignation. You're right, he murmured. For a long moment, the two of them stood there, the silence between them thick with the weight of the decision they had just made. Michael could feel the enormity of what was about to happen. Telling Emily the full truth, telling Sophie, it would change everything. But it had to be done. Let's go back to the house, Jack said finally, his voice low. We need to tell them everything. Michael nodded, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. They turned together and began walking back toward the house. The sun was lowering on the horizon, casting long darkening shadows across the sand. Michael's mind raced, thinking of Emily, of Sophie, of the life that could have been if only things had gone differently. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to entertain the idea of hope. But hope, as he knew all too well, was fragile and easily crushed. The walk back to the house seemed to stretch on forever, as if time itself was holding its breath. Michael couldn't shake the gnawing anxiety in his gut. Would Mary be able to handle the truth? What about Sophie? What would she say when she learned everything she had known was a lie? As they approached the house, the setting sun cast warm golden light across the yard. The air smelled faintly of salt from the ocean, the sound of waves crashing a peaceful background to the storm building in Michael's chest. The house, however, held no peace. Inside, everything was eerily quiet. Jack cleared his throat as he called out, Mary! Emily emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her face still carried the remnants of the confusion and hurt from their earlier conversation, and when she saw the two men standing there, her brow furrowed. What's going on? She asked, her voice cautious. Michael saw the tension in her posture, the slight stiffening of her shoulders, and the way her fingers clenched the towel just a little too tightly. She knew something was coming, even if she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Jack stepped forward, his voice softer than before. We need to talk, Mary. About everything. Emily's gaze flicked from Jack to Michael, her expression cautious. About what? She asked, though her voice trembled slightly as if she already suspected the answer. Michael took a deep breath. This was it, the moment they had all been building toward. He had imagined this conversation in his mind countless times, but now that it was happening, the words felt impossibly heavy. They could shatter everything in an instant. "About your past," Michael said quietly, his voice steady but filled with determination. "About who you really are." For a long moment, Emily didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, as though she couldn't quite comprehend what he was saying. "I already told you, I don't remember anything about my past." Michael swallowed hard, the truth feeling like a bitter pill in his throat. "That's because it was hidden from you. Jack knew who you were, but he didn't tell you. Your name isn't Mary," he said gently but firmly. "It's Emily. Emily Turner." Emily stepped back, her eyes widening slightly, her hands trembling. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Jack stepped in then, his voice thick with regret. "He's telling the truth, Mary. I should have told you a long time ago. But I was afraid. I didn't want to lose you." Her face went pale, the towel slipping from her hands as she looked at Jack in disbelief. "What do you mean? What are you saying, Jack?" Michael watched as Jack's shoulders slumped, his years of guilt and secrets coming to a breaking point. "Your name isn't Mary. It's Emily. Emily Turner. You washed up on that shore all those years ago, and I knew who you were. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to lose you." Emily's eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion, her body stiffening as if she couldn't comprehend what was happening. "No. No, that can't be right," she whispered. "Why wouldn't you tell me? Why wouldn't you?" "I was scared," Jack interrupted, his voice breaking with emotion. "I was scared that if you remembered, you'd leave me. I was selfish. I kept the truth from you because I didn't want to lose the life we had together." Michael could see the pain on Emily's face, the disbelief and hurt. She was shaken, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I don't understand. If that's true, then why don't I remember? Why can't I remember anything about my life before you?" Michael stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Because it was buried deep. Fear. Trauma. Sometimes it makes us forget the things that matter most. But those memories, they've been trying to come back, haven't they? In your dreams. In the flashes. That's your mind trying to tell you the truth." Emily looked at Michael, her eyes filled with unspoken pain. "And you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do you know all this? How do you know who I really am?" Michael's chest tightened. This was the hardest part, the part where he had to admit just how deeply connected they had been, how much they had lost because of what happened to Emily. He took a deep breath and then spoke from his heart. "We were together. We were in love. We were going to get married." Emily's face went pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No. No, that can't be true," she whispered, stumbling over her words. I don't remember any of that." The pain in her voice shattered Michael's heart, but he knew he couldn't back down. "It's true, Emily. We had a life together. We loved each other. But then you disappeared. And I never stopped looking for you. I never gave up hope that I'd find you again." Emily trembled, taking a step back. "But I'm not that person anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm not Emily. I'm Mary. I've been Mary for so long." Michael's voice softened, his words steady yet full of compassion. "You're still you, Emily. Whoever you choose to be from this moment on, that's up to you. But you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know who you really are." For a long, painful moment, there was only silence. The weight of everything that had been said hung heavily in the air, pressing down on them all. Emily stood there, her tears falling freely now as she struggled to process everything she had just learned. Michael wanted to reach out and comfort her, but he knew she had to work through this on her own. Just as things seemed to grow even more complicated, a voice broke through the tension. "What's going on?" Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, her small voice filled with confusion. Michael's heart sank, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. This was the moment he had dreaded, the moment when they would have to tell Sophie the truth about her own life. The reality of the situation hit hard, and he could see the panic in Jack's eyes. The fear that this revelation would destroy everything they had built with Sophie was clear. Jack cleared his throat, his voice shaking. "Sophie. Honey, we need to talk." Sophie frowned, taking a few steps down the stairs. "About what?" Her confusion only deepened, and Michael's chest tightened. He could feel his own heart breaking for her, knowing that this conversation would change everything for all of them. Jack took a deep breath, his voice barely a whisper. It's about who you really are. Sophie stopped in her tracks, her eyes flicking between her parents and Michael. Her expression twisted into one of complete confusion. She couldn't yet grasp the magnitude of what was happening, the bombshell they were about to drop. Jack's voice trembled as he stepped forward, trying to find the right words. Sophie, there's something we need to tell you. Something about your past. Sophie's frown deepened as she took in what Jack was saying. My past? What are you talking about? She asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Michael watched Jack carefully, sensing the struggle in his every movement. Jack's hands were shaking as he gestured for Sophie to sit down. Just sit down for a moment. Please. Sophie hesitated, glancing at Emily, still frozen in shock. Her mother's hands were trembling at her sides. The confusion in Sophie's eyes was palpable. There was a flicker of fear in her gaze, but after a long pause, she slowly walked to the couch and sat down, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Jack exchanged a quick glance with Michael, and Michael nodded slightly, urging him to continue. This was Jack's moment, his chance to come clean, to tell Sophie and Emily the truth. Jack's voice cracked slightly, the weight of the years of hiding this secret bearing down on him. Sophie, I've loved you like my own since the day you were born. You're my daughter in every way that matters. And nothing is ever going to change that. Sophie's face softened a little, but the confusion never left. I know, Dad. Why are you saying this? Jack's eyes filled with unspoken emotion, and he took a shaky breath. Because you're not biologically my daughter, he said, the words hanging in the air thick with gravity. Sophie's face drained of color, and her mouth fell open slightly. What? She whispered, her voice a ghost of sound. Michael felt his heart shatter as he watched Sophie's world begin to crumble before her eyes. The truth she never saw coming. The reality she had never even imagined. Jack swallowed hard, his voice shaking. You're Emily and Michael's daughter. They're your biological parents. Sophie's body stiffened as if struck. She stared at Jack, her mind racing to make sense of the revelation, but it was too much for her to absorb. She blinked rapidly, shaking her head in disbelief. No, that can't be right. I'm your daughter. You and Mom. She turned toward Emily, who stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. Emily's lips trembled as she struggled to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. It's true, Sophie. I didn't know. I didn't remember. But now I do. Sophie's breath hitched and she scrambled to her feet, her body rigid as if the walls were closing in on her. No, she screamed, shaking her head furiously. No, this doesn't make any sense. You're my parents. You and Dad. This is my family. Tears streamed down Jack's face as he stepped toward her, his voice breaking. You are our family, Sophie. That will never change. But we couldn't keep this from you any longer. You deserve to know the truth. Sophie's chest heaved as she took another step back, her emotions too much to bear. Her eyes were frantic, desperate for something that made sense in the middle of the chaos that had just exploded around her. Is it true? She asked, her voice small, broken. Are you really my father? Michael's heart clenched, the pain in Sophie's voice slicing through him. He stepped forward, his own voice thick with emotion, but he forced himself to keep it steady. Yes, Sophie. It's true. You're my daughter. I didn't know. I didn't know about you until recently. But I swear, I never stopped searching for your mother. Sophie shook her head violently, tears flowing freely now. No, this can't be real. You're strangers. I don't know you. You can't just show up and say you're my parents. This isn't how it works. Michael's throat tightened, and he fought to hold back his own tears. He wanted so badly to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but he knew nothing he said could undo the devastation she was feeling. This was her reality crashing down on her, and no words could fix it. I know it's hard, Emily said, her voice trembling as she stepped forward. But we love you, Sophie. We've always loved you. Even if we didn't know. Stop! Sophie screamed, cutting Emily off. Just stop. You don't get to just show up and tear my life apart. I don't want this. I don't want any of this. The room fell into an unbearable silence. Sophie's body was shaking with the force of her sobs, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold the shattered pieces of her world together. Jack took a hesitant step toward her, his voice thick with emotion. "Sophie," he called softly, his hand reaching out toward her. "Honey, please. We'll figure this out. We'll make this work. You're still our daughter. We'll always be your family," Jack murmured, his voice barely audible as he reached out to Sophie. But she wasn't listening. She turned on her heel and bolted for the door, the sound of it slamming behind her echoing through the house. Michael stood frozen, his heart aching in a way he had never felt before. His daughter, the daughter he had never known he had just run out the door, shattered by a truth that he couldn't undo. Emily let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands as she collapsed onto the couch, her body trembling violently with the weight of everything she had just learned. Jack moved quickly to her side, wrapping his arm around her as if trying to comfort her. But his own face was full of sorrow. Michael stood motionless, his mind spinning as he tried to make sense of the storm that had just torn through their lives. He had spent years searching for Emily, for answers, for a second chance at what they had lost. Now that he had found her, now that he had found Sophie, the reality of it all felt more complicated, more painful, than he ever could have imagined. "I should go after her," Michael muttered, his voice hoarse. Jack shook his head, his expression somber. "Give her some time. She needs space right now." Michael knew Jack was right, but that did little to ease the ache in his chest. He had missed so much, so many years, so many moments. And now, after all this time, he feared he might never get the chance to make things right. Yet amidst all the pain there was something else, a flicker of hope. The truth had been revealed. Yes, it had shattered their world, but it had also opened a door that could lead to healing, forgiveness, and perhaps even the family they had lost, and might one day find again. But only if they could all move forward together. The hours following Sophie's departure felt like an eternity. The house was eerily silent, the only sound coming from the occasional crash of waves in the distance. Emily had not moved from the couch, her body hunched over in grief, her hands trembling as she clutched them tightly in her lap. Jack sat beside her, his hand resting gently on her back, but neither of them spoke. The weight of what had just happened hung heavily in the air, stifling any attempt at comfort. Michael stood by the window, his gaze locked on the horizon, his mind a chaotic swirl of emotions. He replayed the moment over and over, the look on Sophie's face, the hurt in her voice, the way she had bolted from the room like she was trying to outrun the truth. He felt powerless, as though everything he had worked toward had crumbled in an instant. He had spent years searching for Emily, for the life they had shared. But now that he had found her, the reality was so much more painful than he could have anticipated. Sophie, his daughter, was out there somewhere, devastated by the revelation that everything she had believed about her life was a lie, and there was nothing he could do to fix it. After what felt like hours, Emily broke the silence. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it sliced through the tension like a knife. "I don't know what to do." Michael turned from the window, his heart aching as he looked at her. She seemed so small, so fragile, her face pale and streaked with tears. This was the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost, and now she was here, struggling with a truth that had shattered everything. Jack squeezed her shoulder gently, his own face etched with sorrow. "We'll figure it out, Mary," he said softly, his voice filled with pain. "We'll get through this." Emily shook her head slowly, uncertainty clouding her eyes. "I don't know if we can," she whispered. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Michael took a step toward her, his voice soft but firm. "You're still you, Emily. Whoever you were before and whoever you are now, it doesn't change the person you've become. You've built a life here, a family, but you also had a life before this. And that's part of who you are too." Emily's tear-filled eyes met his, her expression one of complete confusion. "But how can I just go back to that life?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I don't even remember it. Michael, I don't remember you. I don't remember our love. I don't remember anything about the life we had. How am I supposed to make a choice between two lives? I can't reconcile that." Michael's chest tightened at her words. He had expected her to struggle with the truth, but hearing her say it aloud was harder than he had imagined. The woman sitting before him wasn't the Emily he had once known. She was Mary, Jack's wife, Sophie's mother. In every sense that mattered. And now she was torn between the past and the present. Jack's voice was gentle, but it carried an edge of fear. You don't have to go back to anything, Mary. This is your life now with me and Sophie. We can get through this. We can make things right again. Emily looked between them, her face etched with inner turmoil. But I'm not just Mary. I'm Emily too. I can't ignore that anymore. Michael took another step forward, his voice steady, offering her reassurance. You don't have to choose one or the other. You can be both. You can remember who you were without losing who you've become. Her breath hitched, her tears flowing more freely now. But what if I don't want to remember? What if I can't be that person again? Michael's heart ached, but he knew he couldn't push her. This was her decision, her journey to figure out who she wanted to be. Then you don't have to, he said softly. It's your choice, Emily. Whatever you decide, we'll all find a way to live with it. For a long time no one spoke. The silence in the room was thick with the weight of their emotions, the enormity of the decision that lay before them. Emily buried her face in her hands, her sobs quiet but heart-wrenching. Jack sat beside her, his own eyes filled with pain. I've loved you for so long, he whispered, his voice breaking. I don't want to lose you. Michael's chest tightened as he listened. He had spent years hoping for this moment, hoping that Emily would remember him, hoping they could rebuild the life they had lost. But now, standing here in the middle of a life she had built without him, he realized just how much more complicated it was. He loved her still, he always would, but he also knew Jack loved her too. And in his own way, Jack had been the one to save her when she was lost. After what seemed like an eternity, Emily wiped her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what the right choice is. I don't know if I can be the person you remember, Michael. But I also don't know if I can just forget everything I've learned today. Michael nodded slowly, his heart heavy. I don't expect you to have all the answers right now. Just take your time. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. Jack's voice trembled as he spoke, his hands shaking in his lap. We'll figure this out together, Mary. You and me. We've built something here. Something real. That doesn't just go away because of the past. Emily looked between the two men, her face filled with anguish and uncertainty. I need time, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I need to figure this out on my own. Jack nodded slowly, though Michael could see the fear in his eyes. Take all the time you need. Michael didn't speak. He simply nodded, knowing that there was nothing else he could say. This was Emily's decision to make, her life to rebuild however she saw fit. But the waiting, this was the hardest part. Emily stood, her legs unsteady as she moved toward the door. I need some air, she muttered, her voice thick with emotion. Without another word, she stepped outside, leaving Michael and Jack standing in the stillness of the house. Michael's heart ached with every step she took away from him, but he understood. This was what she needed: time, space, the chance to reconcile who she had been with who she had become. Jack remained seated, his hands covering his face, the silence between them stretching long and heavy. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice muffled by his hands. I'm losing her, aren't I? Michael swallowed hard, the weight of the question sinking into his chest. I don't know, he admitted softly. But whatever happens, we have to let her make her own choice. Jack didn't respond, his shoulders shaking slightly as the full weight of their situation settled over him. Michael turned back toward the window, staring out at the darkening sky, the sea beyond stretching endlessly into the horizon. The road ahead seemed uncertain, filled with more questions than answers. Emily's choice, whatever it might be, would define not only her life but his too. And Sophie, their daughter, was caught in the balance. The house had been quieter than it had ever been in the past few days. It had been nearly a week since Emily had left to gather her thoughts, and her absence was a constant reminder of the tension hanging in the air. Michael and Jack had barely spoken, each lost in their own thoughts, waiting for what seemed inevitable. Michael spent most of his time near the window, staring out at the relentless waves, the sound of the ocean a constant companion to his racing thoughts. The sea seemed endless, just like the uncertainty of what would happen next. Everything was suspended, waiting for Emily to make a decision, one that could shatter everything they had rebuilt. But it wasn't just her choice. It was the path all three of them would have to find, together or apart. Jack, on the other hand, had retreated into himself. He kept busy with the boat, making repairs, spending long hours at sea, avoiding the conversations they both knew were coming. When he did return, there was a heaviness about him, as if he had already resigned himself to losing the woman he loved. Michael never imagined he would feel sympathy for Jack, but he did. Jack had saved Emily when she was lost, had given her a life when she had nothing. And though Jack had kept the truth from her, he had loved her in his own way. It wasn't simple. Nothing was simple. On the third morning after Emily left, the sound of footsteps on the porch broke through Michael's thoughts. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood, watching the door creak open. There, standing in the doorway, was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes weary, but there was a calmness about her that hadn't been there before. Jack appeared from the back room, his expression immediately tense as if he had been holding his breath for days. For a long moment none of them spoke. The silence in the room was thick with the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had been left unsaid. Michael's heart raced as he watched Emily step inside. Her hands were trembling slightly as she closed the door behind her. She glanced at Jack first, her eyes soft with a mixture of affection and sorrow. Then she turned to Michael, her gaze lingering for a brief moment before she lowered her eyes to the floor. "I've made a decision," Emily said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Jack stiffened, his hands clenched at his sides. Michael's breath caught in his chest, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. Emily moved toward the center of the room, standing between the two men who had come to define the most important parts of her life, her past and her present. She looked at both of them, her expression filled with deep sadness, as if she understood the pain her decision would cause, no matter what path she took. "I've spent the last few days trying to remember," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "trying to figure out who I am and what I want. I've thought about the life I had before, about who Emily Turner was, but the truth is I don't remember her. I don't remember that life or the love we shared." Michael's heart clenched painfully as she spoke. The words cut deeper than he had imagined, and he could feel the weight of the rejection in her voice. He had feared this, feared that she would never be able to reconnect with the life they had once shared, the love that had once meant everything to them both. But hearing it spoken aloud felt like a dagger through his chest. Emily's gaze shifted to Jack, her expression softening. "But that doesn't mean I can just forget everything I've learned now. I can't ignore the truth about who I was. I'm not just Mary Coleman, Jack. I'm Emily too. And I need to figure out what that means for me." Jack's face was unreadable, but Michael could see the pain in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he stood, waiting for the final blow. "I love you, Jack," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me when I had no one. You gave me a life when I was lost. But I need to find out who I really am. I need to figure out what part of Emily Turner still exists inside of me." Jack's expression tightened, his jaw set as he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded slowly, the hurt evident in his eyes. He had known this moment was coming. Deep down, he had always known. Michael's heart raced as he stepped forward, his voice steady but full of hope. "Emily, I know this has been hard. I don't expect you to just come back to a life you don't remember. But whatever happens, I want you to know that I'm here for you, always." Emily turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "And that's why this is so hard. I don't remember our life together, Michael. But I see the love in your eyes and I feel it. I know it's real. I don't know if I can go back to that." Michael nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You don't have to go back. We can move forward together." The silence that followed felt endless. Emily closed her eyes, her tears falling freely now. She wiped them away quickly, taking a deep breath before speaking again. "I can't choose one life over the other," she said softly. "I need time to figure out who I am, to reconcile the woman I was with the woman I've become. I don't want to lose either of you, but I know that's not fair." Jack let out a shaky breath, his voice breaking as he spoke. "So what does that mean for us? For you?" Emily looked at him, her expression pained. "It means I need space. I need time to figure this out on my own. I can't be with either of you right now. Not until I know who I really am." Her words cut through the room like a heavy silence, each syllable pressing down on the men who stood before her. Jack's face crumpled, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of her decision had finally taken its toll. Michael stood motionless, the flicker of hope he'd clung to only moments before now fading into a quiet, resigned acceptance. Emily took a small, measured step back, her expression full of sorrow as she looked at both of them, the men who had become such integral parts of her life. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I need to do this for me. For all of us." Michael nodded, though his heart felt like it was breaking in two. "We'll be here," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whenever you're ready." Jack didn't speak. His face was etched with a deep, raw pain as he watched the woman he loved walk away from him. Emily turned and walked toward the door, her steps slow and deliberate, each one heavier than the last. She paused at the threshold, turning back one last time to look at them, her eyes full of sorrow, but there was something else there, a sense of quiet resolution. "I love you both," she said, her voice breaking, "but I need to learn how to love myself again." With that, she stepped out into the world, leaving Michael and Jack standing in the stillness of the house, their worlds forever changed. The days that followed felt like a slow, aching haze. The house, once filled with Emily's presence, now seemed unbearably silent, each room echoing with the absence of the woman they both loved. Jack retreated into his own space, finding solace in the boat, spending hours on the water, while Michael remained in the house, lost in his thoughts, wondering where the pieces of their shattered lives would fall. Sophie, too, had not been seen since the night she ran out. Her absence loomed over them like a cloud. Michael had tried calling her, leaving messages, but each attempt was met with silence. Jack, on the other hand, didn't even try. His gaze held a resignation, a belief that perhaps Sophie was gone from their lives for good. But Michael wasn't ready to give up, not yet. He had already lost too much time with his daughter, and he wasn't about to let more slip away. On the 5th day after Emily's departure, there was a knock at the door. Michael, who had been sitting by the window as he had so many times before, stood up quickly, his heart racing in his chest. He opened the door to find Sophie standing there, her face pale but her eyes determined. "Sophie," Michael breathed, relief flooding through him in a wave. She met his gaze with those same wide, searching eyes, the ones that had haunted him since he first discovered she was his daughter. The tension between them was still there, but it was different now, more tentative, as if they were both waiting for the other to speak. "Can I come in?" Sophie asked, her voice quiet but steady. Michael nodded, quickly stepping aside to let her in. She glanced around the room, her eyes briefly meeting Jack's before returning to Michael. She stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I've been thinking a lot," Sophie began, her voice breaking the quiet tension. "About everything." Michael nodded, waiting for her to continue. Jack stood silently against the wall, his expression unreadable, but Michael could see the flicker of hope mixed with anxiety in his eyes. "I'm still angry," Sophie admitted, her voice shaky but resolute. "I'm angry at both of you for keeping this secret from me, for not telling me the truth sooner." She paused, drawing in a shaky breath. "But," she continued, her voice softening, "I also understand why you did it." Jack's face softened, and Michael felt a sudden rush of gratitude. Sophie was willing to listen, and even though it didn't erase the hurt, it was a step in the right direction. "I don't know how to deal with all of this yet," Sophie confessed. "I don't know how to become someone I didn't even know existed. But I want to try. I want to figure it out." Michael's chest tightened with emotion, but he kept his voice steady. "We'll figure it out together, Sophie. However long it takes, I'm here for you." Sophie's gaze flickered to Jack, and Michael saw the flash of pain in her eyes. "You too," she said softly, her voice heavy with emotion. "You raised me. You gave me a life. I know this is hard for you, but I can't pretend everything is the same anymore. I need to know who I really am. That doesn't mean I don't love you." Jack swallowed hard, his voice thick as he spoke. "I know, Sophie. I love you too. And no matter what happens, you'll always be my daughter." Sophie gave a small, shaky nod, her lips pressed together, as if holding back a wave of emotions. The room fell into a quiet pause, the weight of everything they had lost, and everything they still had to rebuild, hanging in the air. "I want to meet Emily," Sophie said suddenly, breaking the silence. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to ask so soon, but the request filled him with hope. "You should," he said, his voice steady. "I think it would help." Jack's face tightened at the mention of Emily, but he didn't protest. There was a resignation in his expression, as though he had come to terms with the fact that Sophie's relationship with him would never be the same again. He had raised her, loved her, cared for her, but the truth had irrevocably changed everything. "She's trying to figure things out too," Michael added gently. "It's not easy for her, but I know she wants to meet you when you're ready." Sophie nodded, biting her lip as she processed the weight of the moment. "I think I'm ready." Michael felt a rush of emotion, but he contained it. This was Sophie's journey, and he wasn't about to push her in any direction. "Whenever you're ready, I can make it happen." The three of them sat together for a few more moments, the tension easing slightly as they shared the space, each of them processing in their own way. Eventually, Sophie stood, her movements slow and deliberate, as though each step carried the weight of everything she had learned in the past few days. "I should go," she said quietly, looking between the two men. "I need some time." Michael nodded, his heart heavy but understanding. "Take all the time you need." Jack didn't say anything, but the sadness in his eyes spoke volumes. Sophie turned toward the door, pausing briefly before stepping out. "I'll be in touch," she said, offering a faint smile before stepping outside and gently closing the door behind her. The silence that followed was thick with emotion, but there was something different about it this time. This silence was filled with possibility. Michael walked back to the window, staring out at the horizon as the sun dipped below the waves. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that something good might come from all this. The road ahead was uncertain, and there were no guarantees, but he was beginning to see that the chance for healing, forgiveness, and love was within reach.